Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Franchise Euphoria. Josh Brown here. Today's episode is brought to you by Franchise 5. Why Franchise 5? I'm glad you asked. Growing your franchise in a slow, deliberate, and thoughtful manner is a smart way to grow. Franchise 5 helps you do this by expanding 5 locations at a time with a Zen-like focus on the geographic locations that make sense for your growth. To learn more about this, go to franchiseeuphoria.com/franchise5. That's the number 5. So franchiseeuphoria.com/franchise5. Now to today's episode. All right, on today's episode, we're going to do a kickback episode. We're going to look back on an episode that I did back in 2014 with Bob Burg. Actually, it was on February 13th, 2014, and Bob Burg is an author, a leader, a speaker, an influencer, and he and John David Mann, who I've also interviewed, who is a fantastic guy, co-authored the Go-Giver book, which is one of my favorite books of all time. And I spoke with him about that, and also at the time, back in 2014, his book Adversaries into Allies: Win People Over Without Manipulation or Coercion. And it's a fantastic piece of work as well. But I was listening back to this episode recently, and this is why I want to replay it. Because sometimes in podcasting, when you have so many episodes, they get kind of lost in the shuffle of things. But in this particular episode, we talk about, and he explains and walks through, 5 principles that are every bit applicable today as they were back when we spoke in 2014 on in business and in life, how you control your own emotions and understand the clash of belief systems and acknowledging other people's egos and setting the proper framework for a discussion and communicating with tact and empathy, and how all these principles tie in to business and to sales and into life. And I thought it was appropriate to replay this episode in case maybe it got lost in the shuffle, and take note of these principles, because I think they apply across the board and certainly can be beneficial to you as you are working within your franchise system and trying to continue to develop your brand and your customer base and differentiate yourself. So these are timeless principles that we talked about with Bob Burg. So without further ado, I hope you enjoy this episode that was originally recorded back on February 13th, 2014.
Can you really systematically and consistently get the results you want from others while making them feel genuinely good about themselves, about the process, and about you? Our guest says absolutely. Bob Burg is a sought-after speaker at corporate conventions and for entrepreneurial events. He regularly addresses audiences ranging in size from 50 to 16,000. Sharing the platform with notables including today's top thought leaders, broadcast personalities, Olympic athletes, and political leaders, including a former United States president. Although for years he was best known for his book Endless Referrals, over the past few years, it's his business parable, The Go-Giver, co-authored with John David Mann, that has captured the heart and imagination of his readers. It shot to number 6 on the Wall Street Journal's business bestsellers list just 3 weeks after its release, and reached number 9 on Business Week's. Since its release, it has consistently stayed in the top 25 on 800 CEO Reads Business Book bestseller list. It's been translated into 21 languages. It's his 4th book to sell over 250,000 copies. He believes his new book, Adversaries into Allies: Win People Over Without Manipulation or Coercion, is by far his most important work yet. Bob is an advocate, supporter, and defender of the free enterprise system, believing that the amount of money one makes is directly proportional to how many people they serve. He is also an unapologetic animal fanatic and serves as a member of the board of directors of Furry Friends Adoption and Clinic in Jupiter, Florida. Hello, Bob, and welcome to the show.
Josh, thank you. Great to be with you.
Well, thank you. And before we dive into some questions here, I'd like to just take a moment and just thank you and John David Mann for writing The Go-Giver. That was really the first of your books that I read and really think it is powerful, instructive, and really a must read for every small business owner and their teams. So thank you for that.
Well, thank you. I take that as a great compliment, Josh. Thank you.
Well, as you know, Bob, my audience is made up of franchise buyers, owners, and businesses that would like to grow through the franchise model. Your newest book, Adversaries into Allies, Win People Over Without Manipulation or Coercion, touches on so many important points that if followed, I'm convinced will have a big impact on any entrepreneur's mindset and business. Before we dive into the details of the book, I'm curious, what led to you deciding to write this book?
Well, Josh, I think more and more people know that you can really have practically all the positive success traits working for you. You can be very talented and of extremely high character. You can be ambitious, kind, charitable, hardworking, thrifty, energetic, have a knack for numbers, a head for business. You can be creative and even-tempered and all that. And all that, by the way, is great. It's terrific. However, unless you can influence others, and by that I simply mean move people to the desired and appropriate action, then your chances for attaining really significant success are somewhat limited. On the other hand, when combining benevolent intent and a learned skill set, you can find yourself really constantly, consistently, and even predictably attaining satisfaction both personally and in business while adding exceptional value to everyone whose lives you touch. Now, I personally call that ultimate influence, the ability to get the results you want from others while helping them feel genuinely good about themselves, about the situation, and about you. And Josh, the people who can do that are the ultra successful people. You know, we've all seen the people who they are talented and they have a lot of those great skills and traits. And hey, you know, they achieve some very legitimate level of success. And yet somehow they seem to get passed by, whether it's, corporately or whether it's entrepreneurially or whether it's sales, what have you. And those people just seem to have that way with people. People seem to respond to them. People seem to buy into their ideas easier. They seem to have people working with them rather than against them. And this book was really written to equip people to be able to have that skill set.
Well, I love that, Bob, because I really, one of the main things I took from the book that, I sort of had a preconceived notion really my entire life that you were either born with good people skills or you weren't. I never really thought about the notion that they could be taught or they could be learned. And after reading your book, it really kind of resonated with me that, yeah, there is a way to do that. And it's a lot of nuances. And, you talk, for instance, a lot about the difference between persuasion and manipulation. And I'd love if you could explain that and sort of the fine line between the two.
Well, sure, and it's a great question because when you think of it, influence, defined very basically, is simply the ability to move a person or persons to a desired action, usually within the context of a specific goal. So you can influence people in a negative way or a positive way. You could influence them through manipulating them, or you could influence them through persuading them. I see the two of them as being distant cousins, if you will. One's the good cousin and one's the evil cousin. Obviously, manipulation is the evil cousin. But let's face it, they are cousins. And both the because there are certain basic principles involved with both. It's how they're used that makes the difference. I remember years ago reading a great book by a gentleman named Dr. Paul W. Sweats called The Art of Talking So That People Will Listen. And it was really much more about listening as opposed to talking. It was a great book. It was really brilliant. And he gave what I felt was the best summarization of the difference between manipulation and persuasion that I'd ever read. And basically what he said is that manipulation aims at control, not cooperation. It does not consider the good of the other party. It results in a win-lose situation. Now, in contrast to the manipulator, the persuader always seeks to enhance the self-esteem of the other party. The result is that people respond better because they're treated as responsible or response-able, self-directing individuals. So what we see, Josh, is that the difference between manipulation and persuasion, and both the manipulator and the persuader, they understand what moves people. They understand those motivators that people have, and they know how to utilize them. But the manipulator will win at any cost. They may not be intentionally trying to hurt another person, but they don't care if they do, as long as they get what they want. They're totally I-focused or me-focused. A persuader will never do that. Their feeling is for them to win, the other person has to win. Now, so it begins, the difference between the two begins with intent, but that's not where it ends. Because, see, both the manipulator and the persuader, using their people skills, if you will, and I always say there's nothing more dangerous than a bad person with good people skills, and manipulator. And they can both, elicit immediate results. But that's it, because, see, once you know you've been manipulated or taken advantage of or coerced in any way, and all that falls under manipulation, you're not going to do business with that person again. You're not going to buy into that person's ideas again. You're not going to want to join that person again. The trust is going to be gone. On the other hand, when you've been persuaded by someone, you've enjoyed the results. You felt good about the results. You knew they had your best interest in mind, and it was very, very genuine. So yeah, I often say that a manipulator can have employees, but very rarely a loyal team. A manipulator can make the sale, but very rarely have a satisfied customer, and practically never a personal walking referral ambassador. And a manipulator can even have a family who they love and a family who loves them, but very rarely is it a functional family. So not only is manipulation not good business practice, it's not good life practice. It's much more effective and simply much better to be a persuader rather than a manipulator.
Well, I love that, Bob. And I think, for me, when I read about that and just hearing you explain that, it seems to me to really come down to, when somebody who is ultimately manipulating you, they're really coming at it from the perspective of how it's going to benefit them. It's all about them.
Oh, yeah.
And persuasion is more about trying to really help the other person. You really want to persuade them because you feel like, wow, this is really going to benefit them, and it's more about them than it is you. And that really resonates with me, and I completely agree with you that, a lot of these principles, while certainly are often applied in business, when applied, they're applied to your whole life.
Yeah, these are really across the board. I had a lot of people ask, because of my background in sales and my writing, which tends to be around sales and marketing, they asked if this was a sales book. And I said, well, in the sense that when you think of it, everything is in a sense selling, in that you're communicating an idea that you'd like someone to buy into, sure. But and while there are some selling chapters in the book, and the chapters are all basically after the first chapter, which explains the 5 principles of ultimate influence, the chapters are generally about anywhere from 1 to 3 pages, so they're very short. And while I do have some sales vignettes in there, it's really not just about selling in that context. It's about all sorts of working with other human beings, and that's so it goes across the board.
Well, and really, most businesses involve working with other human beings, so it's so vital and important. I mean, very rarely do we have businesses that are in a vacuum. You have customers, you have potential customers, you have potential clients, and so on and so forth. And being able to relate to them in a genuine, authentic, and really a proper way is key. And you mentioned in your last response the 5 principles of ultimate influence, and I'd love to get into that and first just find out, what are they, and really, is ultimate influence different from regular influence, and sort of what the differences are?
Sure. Well, the 5 principles themselves, number 1 is control your own emotions. Number two is to understand the clash of belief systems. And this was certainly a life changer for me. Number three is to acknowledge the other person's ego, acknowledge their ego. Number four is to set the proper frame. And number five is communicate with tact and empathy. And really the only difference between influence and ultimate influence is one is simply the influence itself is the ability to move a person to a certain thought or action, whereas ultimate influence is you are doing so in such a way that everyone comes away a winner. Everyone comes away feeling good about the transaction.
So when you talk about principle one, you talk about controlling your own emotions. I mean, it sounds so obvious and so, well, almost common sense. What do you mean by it?
Well, as human beings, we are emotional creatures. We're emotional beings. We'd like to think we're logical, and to a certain point, we of course we are. But we're very emotion driven, and as human beings, we make major decisions emotionally based on emotion, and then we back those emotional decisions up with logic, or we rationalize, which you could say is to tell ourselves rational lies in order to justify that emotion-based decision. Well, I think most of us understand that. But there's also the type of emotion we need to deal with within ourselves, in which, while certainly no one can make us mad or sad or angry or whatever, what people can do is they can either intentionally or more than likely unintentionally say or do things that pushes our buttons and causes us to make ourselves mad or angry or sad or depressed or confused or what have you. When this happens, we're operating out of a position of weakness. See, the sages asked, who is a mighty person? And answered, that person who can control their own emotions and make of an enemy or of a potential enemy a friend. It's only when you can control your own emotions, Josh, that you're even in a position where you can take a perhaps negative or potentially negative situation or person and turn that into a win for everyone involved. So it's very key that we're able to understand this. Now, this is not to say that emotions are a bad thing. Again, they're a part of life. They're a good part of life, as long as we're in control of them and they're not in control of us. I quote my great friend Don DiScumaci in the book as saying, by all means, take your emotions along for the ride, but make sure you are driving the car.
Well, I love that too, Bob, because I love some of the practical examples and that you share in the book. I mean, one of which that sticks out is, I believe you said it was Abraham Lincoln who, whenever he was angry or would have virtue, he would write a letter, seal it, and then immediately tear it all up. So in other words, he'd get it all out of himself, but then was wise enough to be able to shred it into a million pieces so that it could never possibly be sent. I mean, I know for myself, I tend to, what I've started to do is I will write emails. And, that's sort of the danger with email, is that it's so quick. And so if people don't stop, they could really send emails that they regret. But what I've gotten in the habit of doing is when I write an email, I leave blank the to part of it, so where it's going, so that it's not possible for it to accidentally be sent. But I just think that is so critical. I mean, in my field of law, I've seen it so many times where people send emails that they regret. And a lot of times, quite frankly, it's the lawyers going back and forth. And you often hear, I'm really sorry, I should have never sent that. And it's one of those things that's just, it's vital to your ultimate success and ultimate influence on others.
Yeah, well, it very much is. And of course, the comparison to Lincoln's day would be email, would be Facebook or LinkedIn or Twitter or whatever, Google Plus, whatever social medium you're on at the time. And so, yes, we absolutely, we can write the letter, write the email, put every invective in there, everything you want. But absolutely do not send that until you are absolutely, positively sure it's the right thing. And before it's the right thing, you'll have taken out all those invectives, and you'll take out all the curses, and you'll take out all the insults. In Adversaries and Allies, I've got different examples of letters just different ways of wording things that will help you to not fall victim to that lack of control of your own emotions. It can never hurt. That can never help you. It can possibly hurt you, but it can never help you when your emotions are controlling you. Now, there is a time and place to be angry. There's a time and place to say things that are right. But as long as we're in control of ourselves when we're doing it, and it's a conscious choice, that's the key.
Yeah, you have to be able to sort of separate it, right? I mean, you have to sort of be able to separate yourself from that emotion to really be effective. And you know, it just never, it never ever is going to hurt you to just wait a little bit longer to send that email, to give yourself that one more chance to read it over and really be sure. So I think that's a great point. And you know, in principle number 2, you speak about, principle number 2 is understand the clash of belief systems. And I'm curious what you mean by belief systems.
Well, a belief can be defined as a subjective truth. It's the truth as you understand the truth to be, or the truth as I understand the truth to be. It's not necessarily the truth. It's our truth. Now, sometimes one's truth and the truth are the same, but often they're not. And they're really typically based on the lens through which a person sees their world. A belief system, as I call it, is comprised of everything from upbringing, environment, schooling, news media, television shows, movies, popular culture, cultural mores, everything you touch, taste, see, hear, smell, everything that's ever touched us. But, you know, Josh, the crazy thing is that it basically is pretty well set by the time we're little more than toddlers. And then everything that comes in is sort of based on that. And so forth. So what happens is, as human beings, as adult human beings, most of us are, actually all of us, are run by an operating system, our belief system, that we're not even aware that we're being run by. Now, that's insidious enough, but now understand that this other person, whether it's that other lawyer, whether it's a client, whether it's a customer, whether whomever, they're also run by their same set of beliefs, their operating system that they're not aware of. Now, let's add one more thing to this. As human beings, we tend to believe that everybody else sees the world the same basic way that we see the world. How could it be any other way, anything else? It's how we see. We don't know anything else. We believe how we, and that's why you hear people often say things like, everybody feels that way. Nobody likes that, which isn't really necessarily true. Or you may have heard someone say, or maybe even fall into the trap of saying this yourself. I know I have. Oh, I would never speak like that to someone, or I would never say that to someone. Well, no, we wouldn't, because that's not congruent with our belief system, but it is with someone else's. So in this case, what we really need to do is not necessarily understand their belief system. The fact is, they probably don't fully understand their belief system, and we don't have 20 years to try to understand it. What we need to do is simply understand that they most likely see the world from a different set of beliefs than we see the world. And as long as we understand that, now we can operate within that context in such a way that it's a win for everyone involved.
Well, and you know, and belief systems really form the basis of each individual's ego, which, you know, ties in perfectly to principle number 3, acknowledging their ego. I mean, it sounds so important, but how do you do that?
Sure. And well, you know, the ego, really, when you think of it, is nothing more than the I. It's that part of ourselves that recognizes and realizes that we are a unique individual, separate from every other thing and even every other person, which sounds a little politically incorrect to say these days when there's so much talk of, we're all in it together, or all the, and hey, let's face it, even Napoleon Hill talked about universal consciousness, and we know from quantum physics that everything really is connected, and that's fine. None of that contradicts the fact that in our earthly human existence, we operate as individuals. Now we can join certain groups. We can be part of different groups, teams, communities, businesses, what have you. That's fine. All that's great. But we also operate as individuals, unique individuals, and we all have our own ego. And when that ego is like emotions, and ego is very closely tied to emotion. When we're in control of our ego and we're directing our ego, we can accomplish great things, both for ourselves and for society as a whole. It's when our ego is in control of us and gets away from us, now we start acting in a very counterproductive way. Well, it's the same with this other person. And when I say acknowledge the ego, I don't mean you verbally say to that person, hey, pal, your ego, get a grip. That will have just the opposite result. What I mean is to acknowledge to yourself, acknowledge that if they're acting in a way that's rude or not kind or counterproductive, not even in their best interest, but there's a good chance their ego has gotten has taken control. And if we don't acknowledge that, we're not allowing ourselves to be in a position where we can work effectively with that. Josh, I don't think it's going out on a limb at all to say that the main ingredient for being able to move someone to take a certain action is how you make them feel about themselves. And when they feel good about themselves and good about you, they're most likely to take that action.
Yeah, I could not agree more. I mean, especially because, so we have encounters every day with people, right? And I think we don't know what experiences they're coming from, what mood they're in, what things have affected them. But yet a lot of times people will take a certain reaction a certain way because they're coming from their own perspective. But if you can take in that moment, and I think, this is so important for small business owners, or that if you can look at your customer and understand that they've got a whole nother world that they're coming from just like you, and you can make them feel good in those moments that you're with them, you're going to have a much better chance of winning them over.
Oh, absolutely. No doubt about it. And that's why authenticity is a real big part of it. You've got to genuinely want to benefit that other person. You've got to genuinely care about them because people respond to that and they know. They usually, hey, there's some people who can fake it pretty well for a while, and those are the manipulators. But, most of us, we need to be genuinely interested in that other person, and they need to be able to sense that.
Now, principle number 4 is set the proper frame. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, a frame is simply the foundation from which everything else evolves. To give a very quick example, I shared this in the book. I was at a Dunkin' Donuts store, and there was a little boy, a toddler, probably 2.5 years old, was kind of running around the place, and he began to walk toward his parents. And he fell. He took a spill, and he didn't hurt himself, but you could tell by the look on his face that he was shocked. He intuitively knew that was not supposed to happen. So he immediately looked at his mom and dad for their response, for their interpretation of the event. What happened, but he wanted to know what's next, right? And his parents, I truly believe, had they gotten panicky or upset or, oh no, are you all right? Oh, my poor baby. I think he would have started to cry. But his parents just handled it so beautifully. They smiled and they applauded and they said, oh, what a good trick. That looked like so much fun. And immediately he started to laugh. Well, what his parents did, Josh, is they set a productive frame from which he could operate. And this is something we always have the opportunity to do when we first meet someone and we first enter into whether it's a business transaction or personal transaction, what have you. It can be as simple as a smile. Dan Goldman in his book Emotional Intelligence talked about a smile as being, practically irresistible. It's almost impossible when someone smiles at you not to smile back. Not that there aren't people who don't, but by and large, most people do. They feel good when they're smiled at. Hey, it might also be that you're in a conversation with a few people. Somebody walks into the room and you can tell they want to come over and join the group, but they're tentative. So what do? Maybe you open up your body language a little bit so they know that they're welcome. That's setting a frame of openness. So we can always do that in a transaction. The key is to be able to reset somebody else's already negative frame. And that's the person who comes into this transaction in a bad mood, or maybe they're a win-lose negotiator type, or they just see others as the enemy, who knows? And it's when we can do that we always see in any difficult interpersonal transaction, a frame will be set. The only question is who's going to set the frame. If you allow them to, or if you just let them, then you're taking a chance. You're depending on luck that this person's going to understand a frame, or that they're going to consciously or unconsciously set a productive one. But that's luck. If you set the frame, now you have a great idea as to how this is going to progress.
Yeah, no, I really love that, and I really relate to the story you told about the baby or the kid. I have two young ones myself, and we realized that with our first daughter when she was younger. When you're a new parent, and any time your child trips or falls, it's like, oh my God, But what we found out quickly, just like you said, was when we reacted that way, that set off a reaction in our daughter. But when we reacted in no big deal, or joke about it, she wouldn't cry. And that was, I think, and I could totally resonate with that, and it's so true. And finally, you talk about principle number 5: communicate with tact and empathy. Can you explain that a little bit more as well?
Sure. This is such a key, because you can do all the other 4 perfectly, but it's really being able to communicate with tact and empathy that brings it all home. My dad has always defined tact as the language of strength. And I think that is just so right on the mark. Really, when you think about it, one of my favorite books was How to Have Confidence and Power in Dealing with People by Les Giblin, written years and years ago. And what he wrote was, what counts is attaining personal satisfaction without trampling upon the egos of those you deal with. And so we see how tact is so related to ego, is so related to framing, is so related to emotion. It really brings it all together. Tact is really, when you think of it, it's a way of being able to correct a person, critique a person, dare I say, constructively criticize a person. And not that we want to do any of those things, of course not. But hey, we're talking about the real world, not a fantasy world. And there are times, people do things that are incorrect. They overpay on a negotiable product, or they give maybe they give a potential franchisee some wrong information, or a customer the wrong quote, or they're disrespectful to somebody, or they're not providing great customer service, or they're talking disrespectfully to a family member. We've got to be able to teach, but we've got to be able to do so in a way that not only will the person not be defensive about it and resistant to us and our message, but they'll be very open to us and very accepting of our message. And that's what tact and empathy allows to happen.
Now, you say that there's one question you can ask that is pretty much guaranteed to keep a potential misunderstanding from ever actually taking place. We got to know that one.
Well, this is actually very, very simple, and it has to do with belief systems. Because remember, with belief systems, we take different ideas, thoughts, words, and we interpret them different ways, and not only through our own lens, Josh, but we assume everyone else has the same lens as us. Remember, we were discussing that earlier. So it could be something as simple as, your friend says, hey, you want to meet tomorrow night at 5:00 at the beach? And you say, yeah, sure, I'll meet you there. So at 5:00, you go to that place on the beach where and I know you're in Indiana, so that's probably not something that's going to happen a whole lot. But let's just say it would. And you go to the beach at 5:00. They're not there. The next day you say, hey, why did you stand me up? I thought we were meeting at 5:00 at the beach. He said, I was there. No, you weren't. Yes, I was. Not well. It turns out while you were at the beach by the ocean, he was at that new restaurant called The Beach. You both took the word the beach and you interpreted through your own lens. Now, let's say you're with your team and you say, hey, the client called and there's a change in the deadline needs to be done as soon as possible. Well, what does that mean? One person in your team, to them, as soon as possible means it has to be done right away, so they don't go to their kid's ball game that night and they stay up all night. They do all the work. Another person, they believe that means at the end of the week. Another person, to them, they come from a situation where as soon as possible means as soon as the previous job's done. So you've got 3 or 4 different people all assuming different things. What the person would say is, what the team member would say is, Josh, just for my own clarification, when you say as soon as possible, is there a specific date you have in mind? And what that does is it calls for total clarification. There can be no misunderstanding. So the actual sentence or the actual question is, how would you define, or what do you mean by? But you want to say it, I put sort of a tactful softener in front of that so it doesn't come off as making a person defensive. So I'd say, just for my own clarification, or just to make sure we're all on the same page, when you say X, what exactly do you mean? And that way, that now the same thing when you're the one that brings the news that it needs to be done as soon as possible. You need to make sure that you say, just to make sure that I have us all on the same wavelength. When I say as soon as possible, that means, Wednesday by end of day, 5:00. In other words, you ask the other person to define their term.
Well, and I love the story you tell in the book about, I think it was a friend of yours that called you up and said, hey, I'm looking for a house.
Right near the ocean, or how far from the ocean or something, yeah.
Yeah, and you said, oh, yeah, that house isn't close to the ocean. He comes out and, you live across the street from the ocean, whereas, the house was 7 miles from the ocean.
Right.
And for him, coming 700 miles away from the ocean, that's close, but it's not close from your perspective.
Right. Those are the subjective truths at work. I mean, the truth was it was 7 miles from the ocean. My truth, living right near the ocean, is that 7 miles is far away from the ocean. His truth, living 700 miles, is that 700 miles, or is that 7 miles isn't far at all. So, why didn't I say it's 7 miles? I don't know. It was a long time ago, and I don't remember the circumstances, but we both did end up having a good laugh over it.
But, it's just one of those things in common conversation you don't think of. And I think the bigger point to business people and people in general is take the time to really ask that one more question. Make sure you're absolutely clear and understand that, we can't really assume anything.
Exactly.
Now, before we go, I mean, you tell a really delightful story about your dad, and I know your dad and mom have had such a big influence on you. But you tell a story about when you talk about how much character has to do with our ability to influence. And if you wouldn't mind, would you share with us that story?
Yeah, well, what happened, I think I was about 10 years old at the time, and we were having new carpet put in. And the crew chief was a nice guy, but he was a little rough around the edges and so forth. And at noon, my folks bought pizza for the crew, so my dad brought it up for them, and then he went to talk to the crew chief just to find out how the job was going. And I was just sort of around the corner, and I was just listening in. And the crew chief said, now, my dad's the kind of guy, he came from very poor, Americana, depression, from the streets background, and he's the guy who everybody can relate to. Just he's one of these people. He did have, and still does to this day, have those natural people skills that most of us don't have. But just everybody loves my dad, and so I guess this guy, figured it was male bonding. Talk disrespectfully about wives, and which is something he probably, I would imagine, did quite a bit. And I say that only because of the conversation. He said to my dad something like, well, Mr. Burg, this is a really expensive job. Those women will really spend our money for us, won't they? And I know he expected Dad to say something like, yeah, well, or something. But I knew Dad would never answer like that. There's no way. And, but Dad would also never insult the person either. He would do it in his kind, tactful way. And Dad said something like, well, when they're the reason you've got what you have, you're happy, to do anything you can for them. And that wasn't the answer, that the crew chief was expecting. And he tried to get, well, yeah, I understand that, but boy, they'll take advantage of that, or something, whatever it was. And Dad said, well, I'll tell you what, when they were there with you before you had anything, and they're the one that stood by you the whole way, it's a pleasure to, it was like that. And I think the crew chief tried one more time, and it was also unsuccessful, and he just gave up at that point. But I really don't know if he learned a lesson about how a real man talks about his wife, but I know I learned a great lesson there about what character really is. And I think when it comes to leadership, I think when it comes to influence, Josh, as important as the right words are, it's probably the least important. What you do is certainly more important than what you say, but when it comes right down to it, I think it's really simply who you are. And that's where character comes into play. And what I notice about people of high character is that they tend to stand for something. And with people of high character, you tend to know exactly where they stand. Now, that doesn't mean they don't make mistakes. Of course they do. It doesn't mean they don't course correct. Absolutely they do. And it doesn't mean they won't be flexible at times in terms of methods, but they'll never be flexible when it comes to value-based decisions. I always love what Zig Ziglar said: be flexible on method, but Jen, I apologize, but like a stone when it comes to values, or immovable with values. And I think that's really what it's about. And that's just, I don't think I ever heard my parents, I know I never heard my parents ever speak disrespectfully about each other to friends or relatives or anyone like that. It just isn't something that would have happened. And hey, they're a regular couple, doesn't mean they never had problems or never had, but no, you'd never have heard something disrespectful. And to me, that's character.
Well, thank you for sharing that. I think that's a great story with a great lesson. And Bob, I love the combination of the psychology of what you do and write about, combined with the practical implementation and aspects of it. And I'd love for you to tell us, where can my listeners learn more about you, and where to find your books and upcoming events and so on and so forth.
Thank you. They can visit Burg.com, and that's spelled BURG.com. And while they're there, on the right-hand side, they can click on a graphic of the book, Adversaries into Allies. And if they click on that, it will take them to a page where they can download chapter 1 to see if they like it first, and they can click through if they'd like to order from Amazon.com or BarnesandNoble.com, or they can get it at their local bookseller. They can also subscribe to my Influence and Success Insights, where we send out value-based information about every week or so. And they can also, where it says to check out the Go Giver Way or join our Go Giver community, it's a Go Giver online member community, which is a lot of fun, and it's a really profitable way of doing business, tapping into the 5 laws. And we've got people from all over the world that are now a part of it. It's really growing. So come on to Burg.com, B-U-R-G, and hang around.
Well, thank you again, Bob. I look forward to continuing to read your books as you continue to put them out. And following all your great successes. I really think what you're doing is fantastic on many levels, and really is having a big impact on a lot of people. So thank you for that.
Wow, Josh, I appreciate that a lot. It's great being connected with you on social media and getting a chance to speak with you on the phone and be on your show.
Absolutely. We'll talk again soon.
Would love it. Thank you.
Thanks for being with us today on the Franchise Euphoria podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to go to iTunes and provide a review. Also, please remember that although Josh Brown is a licensed and practicing attorney, nothing contained in this podcast should be construed as legal advice, because it is not. The information contained in this podcast is general and educational in nature, and none of it should be relied upon as legal advice. That being said, if you have questions for Josh and would like to contact him, please email him at josh@franchiseeuphoria.com. Thank you so much for listening, and we hope you tune in to our next weekly episode.